Then in 1913, they ended tariffs, okay? They ended tariffs. Somebody got stupid, and they ended tariffs.
No, somebody got stupid on Saturday and said they ended tariffs in 1913. The United States of America did not end tariffs in 1913 and continued to have tariffs on various products throughout the 20th and 21st century. That was Donald Trump insulting the intelligence of his CPAC audience, and they loved it. Donald Trump has mounted an all-out assault on the intelligence of his audience at CPAC for years now, and Donald Trump has won. Stupidity reigns at CPAC now and has every day of the Trump era. The very first keynote speaker at the very first conservative political action conference in 1974 was Ronald Reagan, and they loved him, and they loved the Reagan presidency. Ronald Reagan was a typical anti-tariff Republican of his era, and he began the groundwork for what became the North American Free Trade Agreement, work that was continued by Republican President George H.W. Bush and then completed by Democratic President Bill Clinton. CPAC used to be opposed to tariffs. CPAC used to understand that only Americans pay American tariffs. The Trump tariffs are not paid in foreign countries by foreign countries. The Trump tariffs are paid in America by American consumers. The Trump tariffs are taxes, something that CPAC has always opposed. Donald Trump's tariffs are increases, in effect, in sales taxes on products sold in America. CPAC used to oppose that vehemently.
You know, everyone said, oh, it's a tax on our... It's not really.
Yes, Donald Trump wouldn't dare finish that sentence. You know, everyone said, oh, it's a tax on our... And then he stopped. Our what? Our people, our consumers. That's who's paying the Trump tax in the form of Trump's tariffs. President Trump is so confident in the stupidity of his CPAC audience that he said this.
You know, I'm building the wall. We're finishing the wall. We got a lot of money. It's in the thing.
Everyone who can read facts knows that Donald Trump is not building the wall. There will never be a Trump wall, but Donald Trump can still reduce a CPAC audience to mindless chanters about building the wall that will never be built. Because he has worn them down, he has brainwashed an audience of followers eager to be brainwashed. Since World War II, psychiatrists and social psychiatrists have been intently studying the relationship of leaders like Donald Trump and their followers. In The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, the book that I mentioned, former CIA psychiatrist Gerald Post writes, the relationship between Trump and his hardline followers represents a charismatic leader-follower relationship whereby aspects of the leader's psychology unlock, like a key, aspects like his followers' psychology. And having unlocked them like a key, Donald Trump is now putting in their minds the words he wants them to say when Michael Cohen publicly testifies about Donald Trump committing crimes, or when the Mueller report comes out, or when the Democratic House committees continue to pile up incriminating evidence against the president. There is one word that Donald Trump needs everyone at CPAC and all of his followers throughout the country to say all at the same time, and he said it to them on Saturday. He said that after Republicans lost the House of Representatives in the last election, the new Democratic chairman in the House, who have been there a long time, are all of a sudden trying to take him out. And here are the exact words that the president used in saying that.
Now we have people that lost, and unfortunately, you put the wrong people in a couple of positions, and they leave people for a long time that shouldn't be there. And all of a sudden, they're trying to take you out with bullshit, okay? With bullshit.
That's the word Donald Trump wants millions of people to scream the day the Mueller report comes out, or the day the House Judiciary Committee votes on articles of impeachment. And yes, that audience, in that audience are some of the people who were outraged that President Obama wore a light-colored summer suit in the summer because it was for them a grotesque departure from what they believed was a presidential norm. Now, they did seem to forget that Ronald Reagan wore the same kind of suit in the summer. Trump followers used to be a very harsh border patrol protecting what they believed was presidential decorum before Donald Trump came along. They were eagerly ready to attack a Democratic president for using unpresidential language or wearing the wrong color suit. And now they are ready to learn a new chant, a new one-word chant that Donald Trump began teaching them at CPAC. Donald Trump is getting them ready to go with that one word that I can't say on TV because it is beneath the dignity of an anchorman, an occupation played in the movies by Will Ferrell. Donald Trump has found a spot below that in his public speech, and his followers are doing what they've done every time Donald Trump has said and done something previously offensive to them. If someone else had said it, they have followed Donald Trump to that new low. Those followers of Donald Trump are lost, believing things they didn't used to believe, approving of things they didn't used to approve of. Unless the impeachment process catches up with Donald Trump, Trump followers will remain lost in Trumpism until the majority of Americans who have always opposed Donald Trump and Trumpism turn out in full strength in the next election and do an intervention for Trump followers that removes Donald Trump from office and breaks their addiction to Trumpism. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.